Reservations from Fort Charles Prime Rib are nearly impossible to get as it's one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City. However, I didn't have a reservation. I dined there twice and had no problem getting a table. Simply put, I had to find out for myself if Fort Charles lived up to the hype from their renowned burger to their signature prime rib.
It's a beautiful day today here in New York City. Right now I'm at Washington Square Park, but earlier in the day I had lunch at what is without a doubt one of the most exclusive restaurants in all of NYC. Getting a reservation at this place is next to impossible, but I got in multiple times without a reservation. I am talking about Fort Charles Prime Rib. The restaurant is from the Chicago-based restaurant group known as Hogsalt Hospitality. They're the same restaurant group that is behind the iconic Au Cheval. Now, being from Chicago, I am very familiar with Hogsalt Hospitality and their restaurants, and it makes me so proud that a Chicago-based restaurant group has the most sought-after restaurant in NYC. I've been to so many of Hogsalt Hospitality's restaurants from the high end to the low end, and I've never had a bad experience. However, my only sort of criticism with the restaurant group is that they seem to sort of copy and paste their menus from place to place. As a result, I never felt much motivation to go to Fort Charles Prime Rib because it kind of felt like a lesser version of Bavette's, which is a Chicago-based restaurant. Bavette's came around before Fort Charles Prime Rib, and they pretty much have everything that Fort Charles Prime Rib has and more. Still, Bavette's is my favorite Hogsalt Hospitality restaurant, and it is hands down one of my favorite restaurants in the entire world. So with that being said, even if Fort Charles Prime Rib turned out to be a lesser version of Bavette's, it's still a very good thing, and obviously I had to try it. Now, I never really put in too much effort to try to get a reservation online. I knew that would be a very difficult task, but there is always a possibility with coming as a walk-in. And the two times I seriously tried to come as a walk-in, I got in. The reality is, dining at Fort Charles Prime Rib isn't as hard as some people make it out to be. It just takes a little effort, but I had to find out if that effort would be worth it. So with that being said, this was my experience at Fort Charles Prime Rib.
Fort Charles Prime Rib is located in the West Village with the address of Fort Charles Street. The restaurant was established in 2016 by the Chicago-based restaurant group Hogsalt Hospitality and restaurateur Brendan Sodakoff. Sodakoff has opened numerous restaurants in Chicago, but he really made a name for himself with his restaurant Au Cheval, which sells a nationally acclaimed burger. He later brought an Au Cheval location to New York in 2019, but Fort Charles Prime Rib was his first restaurant in the city and the one that everyone wants to go to. In fact, when first round draft pick Jackson Dart came to the New York Giants, Giants legend Eli Manning offered to help him in any way he could, but Dart's call to Manning wasn't football related. Instead, he wanted Eli's help to get into Fort Charles Prime Rib. There's no doubt about it, getting a reservation at Fort Charles is a challenge, but it isn't nearly as exclusive as, say, Rayo's, for example. In fact, I had no problem getting into the restaurant. For both of my meals, I showed up on a Friday for lunch. To ensure that I got a table, I went early so that I would be at the front of the line. On both of my visits, I arrived at around 10:25 a.m. To pass the time, I of course brought a book, but I mainly just did some work. Yeah, waiting isn't fun, but the fact is, I was just as productive working in front of the restaurant than I would have been at home. Soon enough, it was time to be seated. In fact, the seatings began about 15 minutes before Fort Charles officially opened at 12. On my first visit, I was first in line and seated inside the restaurant. In fact, the person behind me was also seated within the restaurant. During my second visit, I was second in line, but seated outside, while the couple ahead of me utilized a professional line sitter and thus were seated within the restaurant.
I feel very fortunate to have gotten a seat. There was a professional line sitter in front of me, although even the people after me, I think like the next 3 or 4, they got tables as well.
There are, in fact, a few tables outside of the restaurant, and it seems as though those tables are reserved for walk-ins. When I ate outside, the weather was perfect, and I certainly enjoyed a fine meal, but the heart and soul of Fort Charles is within the establishment. To put it simply, I loved the atmosphere of Fort Charles Prime Rib. It was intimate, classic, elegant, and took on a vibe of a sort of speakeasy or old school supper club. Servers were well dressed, but the restaurant wasn't pretentious by any means. In fact, I felt relaxed and comfortable right off the bat. Once I settled in, I began to look over the menu, and my goodness, it's expensive. No, those prices aren't in pesos, they're in US dollars. Fort Charles Prime Rib is costly, even by New York City standards. Despite that, I loved the culinary offerings. It's the food everyone wants to eat, from burgers to steaks, but in an elevated format. However, the issue that I have with the menu from Fort Charles and with a lot of the restaurants within the Hogsalt Hospitality group is that they're too similar to each other. In fact, Fort Charles just seems like a spin-off off of what is, in my opinion, the best Hogsalt Hospitality restaurant, Bavette's Bar and Buff in Chicago. The majority of the courses at Fort Charles Prime Rib, including many of the most famous offerings, are available at Bavette's either as what seems to be carbon copies or with minimal alterations. The same can be said, although to a lesser extent, with Hogsalt Hospitality's other New York restaurant, the Monkey Bar. Despite that, I love the menu at Fort Charles Prime Rib. I just wish that it had a bit more character and originality to it. Next, I turned my attention to the wine list, which had some impressive offerings, but on both of my visits, I was in the mood for cocktails. Fort Charles offers a selection of classic mixed drinks, which, like the food offerings, are fairly costly. For instance, the Tokyo Old Fashioned goes for $42. On my first visit to the restaurant, I decided to go with the Penicillin, which consisted of Toki whiskey, ginger, honey, and lemon. That cocktail was well made, well balanced, and it thoroughly hit the spot. Fort Charles Prime Rib certainly did a great job recreating that modern classic, which was in fact invented in NYC back in 2005 by bartender Sam Ross at the legendary Milk and Honey Bar. The establishment also hit the mark with regards to an even more classic drink that I enjoyed on my second visit, the Old Fashioned. I got the classic version, which consisted of Wild Turkey 101 Rye, Demerara, and bitters. Old Fashioned are one of my favorite cocktails, and Fort Charles Prime Rib certainly made a good one.
Damn, that drink is strong. One thing about Hogsalt Hospitality restaurants I've always noticed, they really know how to make a cocktail.
Back on my first visit, it was time for my appetizer, which was the Little Gems salad, but there was nothing little about that dish. That was practically a whole damn head of lettuce. The course also consisted of fine herbs and avocado, which was sort of hidden beneath the lettuce. There was also some dressing on the side, which I was about to put on, but luckily my server informed me that it was different from what was currently on the greens. As a result, I first tried the salad just as it was before adding anything else. Now that was a pleasant dish. The lettuce was fresh and crisp, and its flavor was delightful. As it was only lightly dressed with lemon, olive oil, salt, and fine herbs, which equated to an enjoyable salad. After digging a bit, I reached the avocados. I love avocados. They definitely added a bit more body to the dish. I also tried some of the dressing on the side, which proved to be a great addition as it added some tanginess and richness to the course. Overall, that was a solid salad. Now, no one is going to Fort Charles for a salad, but with heavy food ahead, it was nice to have a lighter course to start off my meal. Although that salad wasn't small at all, that was practically a vegetable garden on a plate. I feel like that dish and a lot of the courses at Fort Charles are meant for sharing. Nevertheless, I crushed that salad. Soon enough, it was time for the main course, and perhaps the most famous dish from Fort Charles Prime Rib, the burger. To put it simply, that burger looks stunning, and with such a beautiful dish, some tableside preparation was in order. I don't think that I've ever had a burger presented quite like that. It wasn't necessary, but it does allude to the fact that it is a special dish worthy of white glove treatment. After the small show, I had two delicious looking halves of the burger, and it was finally time to give it a go. Before I took my first bite, I paused for a moment and thought of just how long I've wanted to try that dish, and then I made my dream come true. That burger was outstanding. It's the definition of a masterpiece. I loved everything about it. Literally every single component of the burger was practically perfect. Now, it's very similar to the burger from Au Cheval, but one of the main differences between the two is the meat. Fort Charles utilizes 2 griddled and pressed Snake River Farms Wagyu patties, which is definitely a step above the 2 prime beef patties on the Au Cheval burger, and I could definitely taste the difference. The meat on the Fort Charles creation had an extra lusciousness to it that was heavenly. Although the Fort Charles burger is also much more expensive, even though the Au Cheval creation is by no means cheap. With the addition of the egg and bacon, the Fort Charles prime rib burger set me back $52.47, and it didn't even come with fries, which I had to get separately. In essence, that was the most expensive burger that I've ever had. Although, when I tried the burger from La Bee, that had a $46 cost, but then rapidly rose in price to $62, but at least that one came with fries. Regardless of price, the Fort Charles prime rib burger is spectacular, and I definitely think one should spend extra to get the egg and bacon. Fort Charles prime rib is just not the place conducive to financial responsibility. Besides, that bacon is a masterpiece on its own. The rest of the burger contains similar elements to the Au Cheval creation, like American cheese, pickles, and onions, but the sauce is different. At Au Cheval, a Dijonnaise is used, while Fort Charles utilizes a Mary Rose sauce, which is a British condiment that is partly made from mayonnaise, ketchup, and Worcestershire sauce. Personally, I prefer the Dijonnaise slightly more, and as a result, I actually would choose the burgers from Bavette's and Monkey Bar over Fort Charles prime rib because those creations also include the coveted Wagyu patties. Still, the burger from Fort Charles is practically perfect, and I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. Plus, the burger was even recognized this year as it was ranked as the 23rd best burger in the world on the world's 25 best burgers list. Although, I still wish that the burger came with fries because the one at Bavette's does. As a result, I ordered the fries separately for about $14 more, but at least it was a decent sized portion. Included with the fries was garlic aioli along with ketchup. The fries, just by themselves, were fantastic. They seemed to have such a strong and amplified potato flavor. The fries were nicely seasoned and were practically perfect just on their own. Still, I enjoyed dipping them into the garlic aioli and ketchup to mix up the flavor. Combined with my burger and cocktail, that was just the perfect lunch. But Fort Charles is a lot more than just a burger. It was on my second visit that I got their namesake prime rib. When it comes to prime rib at Fort Charles, there are a few different options. I got the Fort Charles cut, which comes either sliced or in a large center cut, which was what I got. The center cut is also labeled as the Chicago cut, which how could I not choose that one? Included with the meat was a cup of horseradish cream, a pitcher of natural jus, and some finishing salt combined with herbs. First, I poured some of the beef jus over the prime rib and then dug in. To put it plainly, that prime rib was spectacular.
Now that is a top tier prime rib, absolutely incredible.
The meat on the prime rib had a wonderful flavor, which was partly due to the nature of that being the Fort Charles cut. The difference between the Fort Charles cut and the other cuts is that gorgonzola is added to the meat, giving it some funky aged flavors that I just loved. The meat obviously went well with the horseradish cream, which is a classic pairing. Plus, I appreciated the addition of the finishing salt, which gave the prime rib even more pop. Texturally, the meat was tender, but probably not as tender as it would have been had I gotten the English cut. Plus, the meat definitely had more color than I'm used to with a prime rib. Still, that really was a great piece of beef, and I loved the gorgonzola flavor, but it was also almost $120. It kind of makes the $79 prime rib I had a few months back at Goui's seem like a bargain, and I must admit I enjoyed Goui's offering just a bit more. Alongside the meat, I feasted on a side of the buttery mashed potatoes, but those weren't just any mashed potatoes. The dish also included roasted garlic and chicken jus. From the moment I took my first bite, I realized that there was something special before me. Quite simply, those mashed potatoes were a masterpiece.
These mashed potatoes are so ridiculously good. These are absolutely the best mashed potatoes that I've ever had. They're absolutely outstanding.
The consistency and flavors of the potatoes on their own was great, but the addition of those big cloves of garlic and the savory chicken jus took that side to another stratosphere. Those two components really made that course, and I felt like it was the perfect side to pair with the prime rib. Overall, that was a great lunch. Now, I wasn't feeling like having a dessert that day, but on my first visit, I was, even though I was at the point of bursting. Fort Charles Prime Rib has a modest dessert menu, and I liked the pictures on it. Everything sounded pretty good, but once again, that menu was almost a near copy of the one at Bavette's. I ended up getting a slice of the chocolate cream pie. It was certainly an attractive slice. It contained Valrhona dark chocolate, chantilly cream, chocolate shavings, and an Oreo crust. Quite simply, that dish delivered. It hit on all counts. It was essentially a chocolate lover's dream. It was nice and rich, but the sweet chantilly cream was perfectly able to cut through that richness. Texturally, everything was on point, from the Oreo crust to the cream. Basically, that was the perfect slice, and my meal couldn't have ended better. Now, I wasn't surprised that the dish was amazing. I had it before at Bavette's, but I thought that the quality was a bit better that day at Fort Charles. Overall, both my meals at the restaurant were amazing. I had great food, I enjoyed the atmosphere, and the service was fantastic. In fact, on both of my visits, I had the same server, Jeffrey, who was a true professional. When I asked him if he could get a photo of me, he took the task to the next level by practically staging 2 small-scale photo shoots. After finishing my dessert on my first visit, it was time for the bill, which covered my cocktail, salad, burger, fries, and pie. It totaled to $148.50, but with my tip, I spent about $179. On my second visit, where I had a cocktail, prime rib, and side of mashed potatoes, the bill totaled to $176.30, but with my tip, I spent over $208. Yep, that was expensive.
So that was one hell of a meal. So those were 2 absolutely incredible meals. On every single level, Fort Charles Prime Rib lives up to the hype. The restaurant really succeeds because of a couple of factors, and I think this could be applied to almost every Hogsalt Hospitality restaurant. It's because they serve the food you want to eat. They're not the dainty, tiny little Michelin-starred plates, but they're the big, hearty, and comforting dishes that you just love. I'm talking about food like burgers, fries, mashed potatoes, simple things, but things that are elevated to such an incredible degree. I mean, the burger from Fort Charles Prime Rib is without a doubt one of the best burgers that I've ever had, although I do think the burger from Bavette's is slightly better. It is still a masterpiece nevertheless. The other thing that I really like about Fort Charles Prime Rib is the atmosphere, and this is one facet where I think Fort Charles Prime Rib is superior to Bavette's. Now, I think Bavette's is a fantastic looking restaurant, but Fort Charles Prime Rib is just a bit more intimate and quieter and a bit classier. One of the things about Hogsalt Hospitality restaurants is that they really nail the atmosphere every single time. To sum it up, I think Fort Charles Prime Rib is nearly the perfect restaurant, although it is so damn expensive. At the same time, I do wish their menu stood out a little more, had more original dishes, and had a bit more character than a lot of the other Hogsalt Hospitality restaurants. Because the reality is, you can eat very similar, if not the same things at places like the Monkey Bar and Bavette's. To sum it up, I think Fort Charles Prime Rib absolutely lives up to the hype. It is one of the best restaurants in New York City. It is an amazing place, but if you can't go there, if you don't want to wait in line, there are other options out there. And when I say other options, I mean other Hogsalt Hospitality restaurants that have similar items to Fort Charles Prime Rib. Regardless of that, I had 2 very incredible meals at Fort Charles Prime Rib. It is an amazing place and a place that I will definitely be returning to.